The moment the explosion rocked the forward hold of the medical transport vessel, Marcus Penner had been mid-step with a tray of sterilized gauze in his hands. Gravity surged sideways, lights flickered out, and the walls screamed under pressure shifts. He slammed into the bulkhead, his shoulder catching the brunt of the impact, then slid across the corridor floor as alarms blared. By the time he righted himself, blood was already soaking through his uniform pants. A jagged panel fragment had punched clean through his left thigh. He clamped his hands over the wound with a sharp gasp, teeth clenched against the pain. The ship groaned again, but the emergency doors sealed around him, isolating the corridor. "Status," he barked into his collar mic, breath ragged, no response. He fumbled for his emergency kit, hissing as he dragged himself toward the wall-mounted cabinet. The wound throbbed a deep, wet ache that pulsed with every heartbeat. He wasn't dying, not yet, but he'd seen enough trauma in the last 6 years to know he couldn't afford to wait for help. The cabinet was jammed. He pounded on it, then wedged a maintenance wrench under the edge and forced it open with a grunt. Inside were a suture kit, antiseptic ampoules, and a set of trauma shears. Not much, but enough. He cut his pants away from the wound and hissed again when he saw the full extent. The metal shard had carved a channel nearly 2 inches deep, missing the femoral artery by a hair. It was still lodged in the muscle. He'd have to remove it. "All right, Marcus, you've done this before." "Just not on yourself," he muttered, teeth gritted. The antiseptic burned like acid as he doused the wound. He grabbed the forceps, braced himself, and tugged. The shard slid out with a wet squelch and he nearly blacked out. Blood poured freely now. He worked quickly, flushing the wound, then threading the suture needle with trembling fingers. Every movement sent waves of nausea washing over him, but the stitches held. 25 of them, crude, crooked, but tight. He wrapped the leg, cinched the bandage, and leaned back against the wall, panting. His vision swam. A hiss of decompressing air snapped his attention to the corridor's far end. The emergency doors slid open, and 2 medical officers stepped through, their cloaks bearing the crest of the Thalkish Union. They weren't human, the taller of the two, a pale-skinned alien with a long ridge of cartilage sweeping back from its brow, hurried forward. "Remain still," it said, voice clipped. "You are bleeding, your wound is fatal." "No," Marcus rasped. "It's closed, I sutured it myself." The alien scanned him with a portable field unit, then clicked its tongue against its upper palate. No viable clotting, no regenerative response. "No stasis field active. Hemorrhaging will resume within minutes. We must prepare you for palliative disengagement." Marcus stared. "You're saying I'm dying?" The alien nodded once. "There is no recovery protocol compatible with your biology." "The wound classifies as terminal." Marcus let out a weak laugh. "I've seen worse in a field hospital outside Jakarta. This, I'll limp for a month." The second alien, shorter and darker in hue, leaned in to examine the sutures. "This stitching, it is not machine applied." "You did this manually?" "Yeah, I've got hands. They still work." The tall one shook its head. "That is not medically sound. The tissue will necrotize without regenerative support. You will experience systemic failure." "I've survived worse." "Just get me somewhere I can lie down." The aliens exchanged glances. "You do not understand. It is not a matter of optimism. The wound is fatal." "Yeah, you said that." He pushed himself up with a groan, using the wall for balance. His leg screamed in protest, but he didn't fall. "I've got a field rotation to finish in 30 hours. If I'm dead by then, you can have my boots." The short alien moved to stabilize him, but he waved it off. "Just point me to the medbay." They escorted him silent. The Thalkish medbay was a gleaming chamber of pale green light and humming consoles. Marcus limped to a bench and collapsed onto it, sweat soaking his collar. The aliens scanned him again. "Your vitals are stabilizing," the tall one said, uncertain. "Because I stopped the bleeding," Marcus muttered. "That's what stitches do?" "No, that is not possible. Welcome to Earth medicine." The door slid open and in stepped Captain Voss Terrell, a towering figure of deep blue skin and sharp eyes. He took one look at Marcus and frowned. "You should not be ambulatory." "I get that a lot," Marcus said, leaning back. Terrell turned to the medics. "You declared him deceased." "He was classified as terminal," the tall one replied. "His biology defies expected models." Terrell studied Marcus. "Is this normal for your species?" "Not normal, just trained." Terrell nodded once. "You will rest. Further activity is prohibited." Marcus didn't argue. He lay back and let the hum of the medbay soothe him into darkness. He woke to the sound of soft beeping. His leg throbbed, but the bleeding had stopped. The sutures held. A human nurse, a volunteer named Lena Lark, was seated beside him, checking his chart. "You gave the Thalkesh a heart attack," she said. Marcus blinked. "They don't have hearts." It's a figure of speech. "You stitched yourself up in a corridor and walked into medbay. They filed a report calling it biologically implausible." He tried to sit up, winced, and stopped. "How long was I out?" 18 hours. "They wanted to sedate you longer, but your vitals stabilized." "You've got restricted mobility orders for 10 days. 10 days, he groaned. "Better than dead," he chuckled, and the movement hurt. "Fair point." Captain Terrell entered, his gaze unreadable. "You have been reassigned," Marcus frowned. "Reassigned?" "There is a diplomatic envoy preparing to depart for the Zorak system. We require human medical presence. The Thalkesh have requested you specifically." Marcus blinked. "Why me?" "They believe your biology is unique. Your resilience is unsettling to them." "They wish to observe," he sighed. "I'm not a lab rat." "No, you are now a representative." The Zorak's envoy ship was larger and more ornate, with long, sweeping halls and ambient lighting that adjusted to mood. Marcus limped through the corridors, leaning on a carbon polymer crutch, his legs stiff but healing. The Thalkesh team shadowed him constantly, 3 medics, each with a scanner, notepads, and an endless stream of questions. "Your tissue did not regenerate," one said, "yet it sealed." "This is not understood." "It's called clotting and scar formation," Marcus replied. "Unacceptable method, risk of infection, necrosis." "Not if you clean it right." The aliens were baffled. Their species relied on regenerative pods and nanoreplication. The idea of stitching flesh together with a needle and thread was primitive to them. Barbaric, even, and yet it worked. Marcus became a curiosity. Alien doctors visited his quarters. One brought a model of a human thigh wound and asked him to demonstrate the suturing technique. He did, slowly, explaining the layers of muscle, fascia, and skin. "You use thread," the alien said, incredulous. "Yeah, thread, sterile, tough, works every time." "Why not use cellular glues?" "Because sometimes you don't have that." "You have a battlefield, a bleeding soldier, and 10 minutes. They stared, fascinated. His leg healed slowly. After 15 days, the swelling was gone and the stitches were removed. He walked without the crutch by day 20, though he still limped. The Thalkesh updated their medical database to include manual human suture intervention using field kit. They labeled it a temporary emergency measure, applicable only to humans. Marcus just shrugged. "It saved my leg." Captain Terrell approached him during a quiet moment in the observation lounge. "You altered their understanding," Terrell said. "I just stitched my leg," Marcus replied. "No, you survived when their protocols said you would not. That will change their assumptions." "About your kind," Marcus looked out at the stars. "Sometimes surviving is the most human thing we do," Terrell nodded. "Then you have represented your species well." Marcus leaned back, his legs still sore but whole. He wouldn't be running marathons anytime soon, but he was alive. And he'd done it with a suture kit, a pair of hands, and a stubborn refusal to give up, which, as it turned out, was all it took to rewrite an alien medical textbook. Marcus sat on the edge of a metallic recliner that was trying very hard to approximate a soft cushion. His left leg elevated on a transdermal stimulator that buzzed faintly beneath the bandages. The Thalkesh medbay had dimmed its ambient lighting to match his circadian rhythm, a courtesy he hadn't asked for but appreciated. Outside the transparent viewport, a gas giant loomed in rich blue swirls. its gravitational pull gently tugging at the vessel's stabilizers every few seconds. A tray floated toward him, carried by a spindly-limbed orderly with translucent skin and a belt full of diagnostic tools. The tray held a bowl of gelatinous gray cubes and a protein infusion capsule. "Is this lunch?" Marcus asked. The orderly tilted its ovoid head. "It is nutrient-appropriate for a recovering bipedal carnivore. I'm not a lizard. We accounted for that." He poked at the cubes with a sterilized utensil. "You've got a hydroponic garden on board. There's a tomato plant in the aft module." "I helped repot it. Tomato acid is not optimal during tissue repair. I'll take the risk." He winced slightly as he shifted his leg. "Besides, you're studying me. Might as well feed me something I didn't have to peel out of a lab vat." The orderly hesitated, then turned and glided out of the medbay without another word. Moments later, a different alien swept in. This one wore a long diagnostic coat layered with shimmering insignia that shifted color depending on angle. Its narrow eyes blinked sideways rather than vertically, and it carried a slate tablet covered in diagrams of human anatomy, annotated with obvious confusion. "You are Marcus Penner," it said. "Still am. I am Infi's Tal, lead xenophysiologist. I am here to confirm that you are not a statistical anomaly." "Well, that's a relief. I was worried I might be accidentally immortal." Infi's sat on a low stool and gestured toward Marcus's leg. "You performed a procedure that would not be survivable in our species, yet your cellular degradation is within tolerable limits. Your white cell count indicates active defense. You achieved hemostasis without external stasis technology." Marcus leaned back, careful not to jar the stimulator. "I used a hemostat, gauze, and a curved needle. It's not witchcraft. You applied these implements without robotic precision. No bot can handle a wound when the patient's rolling down a ravine or stuck in a collapsed tunnel. You patch what you can when you can." Infi's tapped the tablet. "How did you determine stitch tension?" "Muscle memory. Practice. You learn to feel the pull. Too tight and you cut circulation, too loose and it breaks open." "That's unacceptable." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Unacceptable. We cannot quantify such a method. It cannot be integrated into a repeatable protocol. That's why we train the hands, not just the minds." Infi stared at him for a long moment, then stood and began pacing slowly. "Are all humans taught this?" "No. Just the ones who volunteer at field hospitals in the middle of nowhere. You chose to do this." "Somebody had to." Infi's tapped furiously at the tablet. "I must observe further." "Your coagulation behavior contradicted over 17 predictive models. Happy to bleed in the name of science." Infi's paused. "That was humor, mostly." A soft tone echoed through the medbay, followed by a voice over the internal comm, the ship's navigation AI, calmly announcing a course adjustment and minor gravitational compensation. The floor shifted slightly beneath them. Infi's returned to the stool. "Do you retain pain?" "Yeah, not the worst I've felt, not the best either." "Would you accept an analgesic? If it won't reboot my liver, sure." Infi's retrieved a thin patch from a cabinet and applied it just below Marcus's collarbone. Within seconds, the deep ache in his thigh dulled to a distant throb. Better, like a fog just lifted off the nerve endings. Infi's narrowed his eyes. "You describe sensations with metaphor. It's how we understand things we can't measure. We do not do that." "Then I guess you're missing half the picture." A low chime interrupted them again, this time followed by a knock and oddity in a ship full of automatic doors. The panel slid open to reveal a being Marcus hadn't seen before. It was tall, robed in a soft green fabric that shimmered like sea glass, with a head shaped like a crescent moon and hands that ended in long, delicate filaments. "I am Aelith," it said. "I am here to discuss the council petition." Marcus blinked. "Council petition?" Infi's stood immediately. "You did not inform me the council had been notified." "They were not. The request came from the Jorai delegation." Marcus looked between them. Someone filed a petition about me. Aelith stepped forward. Your actions have caused concern. The Jori consider your methods potentially destabilizing to interspecies medical protocol. I sewed up a hole in my leg. I didn't invent antimatter. They argue your survival undermines medical consensus. If your species can endure injuries that would be fatal to others, the shared risk matrices must be recalibrated. Marcus ran a hand down his face. So, they're mad I lived. Aelith tilted its head. They seek clarification. They believe you represent either a biological outlier or a deceptive practice. I didn't fake the wound. We have reviewed the footage. There is no suggestion of fabrication, only confusion. Infies folded its arms. They fear humans are misclassified. That your capacity for trauma endurance was underestimated. Marcus exhaled slowly. And what happens if they reclassify us? Aelith hesitated. Human medical personnel may be subject to restricted deployment or increased scrutiny. The diplomatic implications are complex. Marcus stared at the viewport for a long moment. Tell them to watch the footage again, every second. The pain, the blood, the stitches, all of it, that wasn't defiance, that was necessity. They are not questioning your authenticity. They are questioning their own assumptions. I didn't ask for that. Aelith nodded. Few ever do. Later that cycle, Marcus limped into a smaller annex off the main medbay where a training unit had been hastily assembled. Infies had requested a demonstration for several alien medics, none of whom had ever seen a human suture anything in real time. He sat on a stool, a synthetic limb replica clamped to the workbench. The model had been fabricated based on his own injury minus the pain and blood, thankfully. Threads through the needle, he began. You start with a simple interrupted stitch. Enter at about a 45-degree angle, pull through until there's a tail, then loop and tie. A Jori observer leaned forward. Why not use a bonding agent at the filament interface? Because you don't always have one, Marcus said, looping another stitch. This holds even when you're shaking, covered in dust, and your patient's screaming. They watched in silence as he finished the line, tied the final knot, and snipped the thread. Infies stepped forward. Can you replicate this in motion? You mean while the ship's moving? Infies activated a minor gravitic pulse. The room tilted slightly. Marcus braced his elbow and continued without hesitation, placing another row of stitches. The room stayed quiet. Aelith approached the table. Your technique is inelegant, and yet it functions. We're not elegant, we're stubborn. The Jori representative finally spoke. We request access to your training archives, all suture methods, all field techniques. Marcus nodded. You'll need a lot of coffee. They didn't laugh. But Aelith's robe shifted to a lighter hue. That evening, Marcus returned to his quarters. He lowered himself onto the bunk, legs stretched out, and allowed himself a brief moment of stillness. The pain was faint now, more memory than sensation. He stared at his hands, the same hands that had stitched a wound closed in a corridor with alarms screaming and blood pumping. They were just hands. But apparently, they'd started a conversation the galaxy hadn't expected, and tomorrow he'd show them how to tie a double surgeon's knot. The conference hall wasn't designed for humans. The ceiling arched too high, the seating dipped too low, and the ambient temperature hovered somewhere between meat locker and polar expedition. Marcus had layered a thermal vest beneath his uniform, but it wasn't helping much. He shifted in his chair, careful not to jolt his leg, which had begun to itch under the scar dressing. Across from him, a semicircle of Thalkesh, Jori, and 3 other species he hadn't met before arranged themselves behind a curved bench of iridescent metal. They weren't judges exactly, more like a provisional review board. Not a trial. Not officially. But someone had decided that a human stitching his own leg warranted formal scrutiny. Marcus exhaled slowly and adjusted the slate in front of him. The notes he'd jotted down were brief. Suture technique, clotting time, estimated blood loss, and the number of days until he'd been able to walk without assistive support. Nothing about this felt like it should require diplomacy. Aelith, seated at the center, raised a hand. This session is convened to finalize the inquiry regarding biological resilience variants observed in human medical volunteer Marcus Penner. All delegates have reviewed the recorded data and accompanying reports. The delegate from the Jorai contingent, whose skin resembled polished copper and whose eyes moved independently, folded their arms. Our concern remains unchanged. The subject's survival violates current medical thresholds. If such thresholds are invalid, then our triage models must be discarded. Marcus cleared his throat. I didn't mean to mess up your models. I wasn't trying to prove anything. You succeeded nonetheless, the Jorai replied. Aelith turned toward him. Please clarify the series of decisions made following the injury. I was alone in the corridor. The emergency kit was reachable. I knew I couldn't wait for anyone else. So I cleaned the wound, removed the debris, stitched it shut, and compressed it to slow the bleeding. Without anesthesia? Asked a crystalline being to Aelith's left. Its voice sounded like wind playing across glass. There wasn't any, Marcus said. Field kits don't carry sedatives unless there's a risk of shock. I wasn't in shock. Your pain response was not abnormal, it was high. But it didn't matter. You don't stop because it hurts. You stop when you're done. The Thalkesh delegate, who had barely moved until now, leaned forward. The wound penetrated muscle tissue and compromised structural mobility. Yet you stood and walked. I braced against the wall, dragged myself until I could stand. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I just needed to reach the med bay. The crystalline being glowed faintly. What if you had made a mistake during stitching? I've trained for that. You don't place the first stitch unless you know where the last one goes, and if you do mess up, you unthread and start over. You would have undone the wound closure, the Jorai asked incredulously. If it meant doing it right, yes. An improperly closed wound can kill you. Aelith steepled their fingers. Our records show you taught a demonstration of this technique under artificial turbulence. Was that necessary? They asked to see how we do it under stress, so I showed them. Surgery's never calm, not when it counts. The Thalkesh tapped a panel and a holographic projection blinked into place, showing Marcus's hand threading a needle, then passing it through synthetic tissue. The motion was unsteady but deliberate. You used no magnification, no neural assistance. No robotic calibration, nope, just eyes and hands. The Jorai's eyes narrowed. Why would a species rely on such unreliable methods? Because we don't always have a robot in the room. Sometimes it's just you, a bleeding limb, and a ticking clock. Silence settled for a moment. Then the crystalline being asked, have you taught others? Marcus nodded. We train medics early, even civilian ones. If you can't stop a bleed, you can't save a life. Aelith turned to the other delegates. The question before us is whether the human's survival represents an anomaly or an indication of larger species-wide variance. Marcus leaned forward. Look, I'm not saying all humans can do what I did, but some of us train for the worst-case scenario. And when that worst case shows up, we don't assume we're dead. We get to work. The Thalkesh delegate stood. We propose a motion to reclassify human trauma response under Tier 5 adaptation. A species with non-standard survivability behaviors under acute injury, the crystalline being pulsed blue. Agreed. Jorai hesitated, then nodded. With reservation, Aelith turned back to Marcus. There will be no sanctions. However, observers may request further access to your training procedures. Will you permit this? As long as I'm not dissected, sure. Later that evening, Marcus sat in the crew observatory with his legs stretched across a low bench, sipping a cup of what passed for coffee aboard the vessel. It was bitter and a little metallic, but warm. That counted, and Fies entered without asking, holding a tablet with several blinking diagrams. The council accepted the reclassification. Great. So I'm officially weird. You have altered 3 medical teaching protocols and prompted a reevaluation of field trauma guidelines used by 17 species. Marcus blew on his drink. Glad to be useful, and Fies sat beside him. There is skepticism still. Some argue your success was not medical but psychological. I won't argue with that. Half of surviving anything is deciding you will. We do not teach that. Maybe you should. Infies looked at the stars. We have begun documenting manual intervention under duress as a contingency topic. Your footage will be included. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He just watched the faint amber rings of a nearby planet drift past. Infies finally asked, "Do you regret your decision to patch myself up?" Yes, no, it was messy, it hurt like hell. But if I'd waited, I wouldn't be here. Infies tapped the tablet and pulled up a still image of the wound mid-suture. This part fascinated Aelith. The knot. Why tie it like this? It's called a surgeon's knot. Extra wrap gives it friction so it won't slip if the tissue swells. Ingenious, basic. Infies stared at the image for several seconds. Your kind creates stability from chaos. With thread, sometimes that's all we've got. When Marcus finally stood to return to his quarters, his leg twinged. Not badly, just enough to remind him it had happened. He didn't mind, it was part of him now. Scar tissue, sure, but also something more than that. By the next cycle, the training lab had been expanded, not for experiments, for seminars. Marcus agreed to run the first one, not just for humans, but for anyone who wanted to learn how to fix things with nothing but their hands and a little thread. Because sometimes, when the machine fails, the only thing standing between life and death is knowing how to tie a knot that holds. And that, it turned out, was universal.